What you will hear today with the story of this serial killer goes beyond the idea of a serial killer and takes it to a whole other level, a level that will not be just something uncomfortable or annoying to hear, it will reach the level of horror. Today's story will begin with a teenager with a criminal genius, in a remote region in the east of the planet. The story we will tell today is the case of Sasaka Nakamura, who is more famous as the Death Killer of Hamamatsu City. He was an example of commitment and diligence, but later he turned into a killing machine. His actions had dark motives behind them, motives that consumed every ounce of his thought. It is the story of the Death Killer of Hamamatsu, the only deaf teenage killer in Japanese history. Sasaka Nakamura was born in 1924 in Hamamatsu, Japan. He was born deaf and faced many challenges and difficulties from the beginning of his life. Despite the disability that Nakamura had, he was a capable and intelligent person who excelled in his studies and obtained high grades. He was also a polite and talented child, and possessed a wonderful nature and a brilliant mind. So much so that he won a scholarship to complete his high school studies. This boy was not whining and complaining because of his health condition, on the contrary, he faced the whole world without fear. Despite his academic success, Nakamura received bad treatment from his family. His family, who did not know, viewed him as more than a deaf person and were unable to notice his blindness. On the contrary, they saw him as a burden to them, and treated him coldly and ignored him. Until the story continues and the situation gets worse for the child, even in his school he was an outcast among his classmates. The constant abuse she was subjected to left Sasaka with feelings of isolation and loneliness, leaving him lost in the darkness and completely socially unacceptable. After all this, Nakamura started watching films of violence and murder, and entered the world of films that do not need audible words to understand. Katrin found solace and compensation by watching footage of killings in which Japanese swords were used, whether in battles or assassinations. Through these films, he found feelings of power and control that he had been deprived of throughout his entire life. Nakamura was fascinated by samurai films, and his love for knives and the iconic Japanese katana swords increased as he grew older. Cinema was like an entire world, a world that connected with Nakamura in a way that was impossible for words to express. It works, and although most people view these films as pure violence and bloodshed, Nakamura saw something else. As he watched the swift, precise, and deadly strikes of the swordsman, he felt a sense of mastery that allowed him to forget, even temporarily, the isolation and mistreatment he had been subjected to during his life. It is possible that his feeling towards these knives was that they were an extension of himself, a way to compensate for what he had suffered physically and socially during his life, or perhaps he was just enjoying the feeling of the adrenaline rush that comes with using or brandishing such deadly weapons. This escape into violent cinema soon proved to be a very dangerous path for Sasaka. Nakamura's life began to take dark turns, and he began to show violent and aggressive tendencies, and the imaginary scenes he witnessed on screen began to turn into reality, a terrifying reality. Because he started doing violent things himself, Sasaka Nakamura was born deaf, but in the world of the samurai he was able to hear a sound that was louder than words, a sound that could change people's lives, or end them. The date of August 22, 1938 was a fateful day. The young boy, who was only 14 years old, tried to commit a heinous crime. He tried to take sexual favors from a woman, and not only one, but two of them were brave enough to resist him. The two women fought with this teenager. They resisted the attempted rape. Unfortunately for them, their courage met with brutality that no one could imagine, because suddenly this teenager decided to change his plan, and kill them. What later turned out to be that Nakamura was always keeping a knife with him. And this is what made him not take long to inflict his punishment on these two women, because they did not let him complete his mission of raping them. He simply pulled out his knife and began stabbing them to death, imitating the techniques he had learned from his favorite moviegoers. His constant possession of a weapon indicates that he escaped from his home, carrying with him homicidal tendencies that he would not allow anything to stop. Much information about Nakamura and his crimes has been lost or hidden as secret files. Whether he had committed any sexual crimes or murders before the date we mentioned or not is unknown. All we know is that this may not have been his first crime. Despite his lack of hearing, he was able to target victims and then escape with his actions. For 2 full years after this incident, Nakamura did not commit any crimes, at least he did not commit any discovered crimes, but during those 2 years something inside him was brewing. After the brutal murder of the 2 women in 1938, Sasaki Nakamura seemed to disappear from sight. There were no reports of crimes committed by him during these 2 years at all. So, I wonder, did he give up this criminal path? Did he finally understand the consequences of his actions and decide to become a good person? The answer is no. Nakamura was very far from ending his violent behavior and actions. Somehow he was able to continue committing his criminal acts without being detected. Targeting people, then escaping with his actions. The isolation and mistreatment he experienced left him living in weakness and loneliness, but with every behavior that included a violent act, he felt powerful and in control of the course of life, details that he had previously been deprived of. As for how he was able to do all these things, this is still a mystery. Perhaps he relied on his other senses, such as sight and touch, to be able to navigate his surroundings and choose his victims. In fact, it is possible that his deafness was of benefit, because it made it easier for him to get close to people without being noticed, and he may have been using his disability as a way to gain sympathy or to appear as a person who does not pose a threat to the victims. Whatever it is, the only thing that is constant is Ono Nakamura was a professional at avoiding investigations and running away with his crimes, and it was only a matter of time before he struck again and left traces of blood and horror in his wake. On August 18, 1941, Sasaki Nakamura's thirst for blood and power led him to commit a new heinous crime. By this time, Weisel was 17 years old, and he set his sights on 2 unsuspecting women. They did not sense anything wrong. They attacked in the same old way, and he tried to stab them to death. The first woman died at the scene, drowning in a pool of her own blood, while the second was lucky enough to be able to escape. From the death killer, she was able to escape despite the fatal injuries she suffered. Just 2 days later, on August 20th, a series of people were found whose bodies were found, murdered in the same brutal way, with multiple stab wounds that left them to die in pools of their own blood. It is not known from the records whether they were all women or not. The worst part of the matter is that the police had a description of the accused and were actually looking for him, and they knew the accused followed them, Nakamura. But they did not try to make great efforts while focusing on Nakamura. On the contrary, they tried to cover up or hide his crimes and confuse the case.